Good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to FPCI Virtual Public Discussion on Is there an arms race taking place in the Indo-Pacific region? This public forum is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and the title of today's public discussion is already a very interesting question, which I believe all the audience here are eager to discuss about already. First of all, I would like to welcome our distinguished guests who are joining today, the Ambassador of Cambodia to Indonesia, His Excellency Parit Khan, the Ambassador of Japan to ASEAN, His Excellency Akira Chiba, the Ambassador of Italy to Indonesia, His Excellency Benedetto Lateri, the Ambassador of Sri Lanka to Indonesia, Her Excellency Yasoja Gunasekera, the Chargé d'Affaires of Austrian Embassy in Indonesia, His Excellency Philip Rossel, the Chargé d'Affaires of Brunei Darussalam Embassy in Indonesia, His Excellency Yuhanizah Ismail. Welcome to FPCI Public Discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are providing interpretation feature from English to Indonesia. So for participants who want to listen to Indonesian audio throughout the session, you can click interpretation button from the bottom right screen, select Indonesia, and then mute the original audio. And for those who are tuning in from our YouTube channel, we have two links for the original audio, which is English, and also one other for Indonesia audio. Kami menyediakan penerjemah dari bahasa Inggris ke bahasa Indonesia. Bagi para peserta yang ingin mendengarkan dengan audio bahasa Indonesia, bisa klik interpretation di layar bagian bawah, lalu pilih Indonesia, kemudian mute original audio. Without further ado, to start our discussion today, I would like to invite Dr. Dino Patijalal, the founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, to open the discussion. Dr. Dino, you may have the floor.
Thank you. By the way, I'm hearing some background noise, so whoever has the mic on, please turn it off. I want to welcome everybody who's joined this very interesting session. We have about 700 people, or close to 800 or 900, I hear, and coming from about 42 countries. Yeah. So well done, and I'm pleased that you all can join us here. You know, just by way of opening, it's a foregone conclusion that geopolitics or geostrategy now has taken center stage in the Indo-Pacific. And commensurate with that development, we're seeing some interesting developments, especially in terms of defense buildups in some parts of the Indo-Pacific. Some say this is just military modernization, but there are others who say that this is part of an emerging new arms race in the Indo-Pacific. And obviously, this is a matter of great importance to discuss because in our region, the Indo-Pacific, this is where the geopolitical weight of the world is shifting. The economic weight of the world is also shifting in this direction. And there's plenty of competition and rivalries. And in fact, strategic trust is declining. Political tension is rising. And there are different competing geopolitical concepts, security concepts, and architecture, and also economic architectures that are competing, and also overlapping, right? So today we have three panelists, all from Southeast Asia. We have Andi Wijayanto, former cabinet minister and one of prominent defense experts from Indonesia. We have Dr. Colin Koh, who is from Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and he's member of editorial board of Journal of Defense Studies and Resource Management. And Professor Richard Hidarian, who is one of the most outspoken Filipino foreign policy analysis, and also my very good friend and a frequent speaker at FPCI events. So let me begin with a question to Andi Wijayanto. What are we seeing in the Pacific? Military modernization or an arms race? And should we be worried or not? Yeah, Andi.
Thank you, Padino. I think for the last 10 years, we see very significant shift in terms of defense development in in our world. I think in 2005 and 2006, there was a study made by several scholars in Europe that consider that now we re-entering the era of conventional warfare. Yeah, if we remember from 2001 until maybe from 9/11, the attack of 9/11, maybe until 2005, 2006, we consider that the type of war has shifted from conventional warfare into asymmetric warfare, counterterrorism, and so on. For 2005 and 2006, we saw the event in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, that the superpower like United States, Russia, conduct military operation to counter terrorist threat, but they use conventional warfare strategy. So the return of conventional warfare is quite significant from 2005 and 2006. In our region, in East Asia, of course, we see the continuous development of China military build-up. For me, it is not only modernization, but it is already in the phase of arms build-up. Yeah, if we use the theoretical framework made by Barry Busan, the arms dynamic, Barry Busan and Eric Herring, arms dynamic, they divided arms dynamic into several phases. The lowest one is they call arms reduction. Then after that, military modernization. Then arms build up. After arms build up, the highest level is the state that capable to launch a revolution of military affairs. What China did since I think the early year 2000 is not only military modernization, but already in the phase of arms build up. The next question is whether China can absorb and adopt new technology to launch RMA for its military. So from arms build up and then escalate into revolution of military affairs. To do revolution in military affairs, then China must introduce a new type of weapon system, such as the hypersonic missile, the satellite-based weapon, cyber weapon, EMP, and so on. Yeah, another research made by Michael O'Hanlon in maybe 3 years ago stated that there will be 7 new military technology developed by China that will enable China to initiate its own revolution of military affairs. So the next question is, what should we do about that? Do we have to rely on regional arms control, which is do not exist in our region, or we have to rely in a more soft mechanism such as ASEAN and so on? But to answer your question, we are no longer in the path of military modernization, but we already entered the era of arms build-up in this region.
Yeah, Colin, it seems from Andy's response that the most prominent part of the arms race is between US and China, with the assumption that China is the only country that can compete with both technology and resource-wise with the US military posture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, allow me to thank FPCI, Park Dino, Park Kelvin, Jenny for organizing this. Now, in response to your question, Park Dino, is that if we are looking at various sectors of the arms build-up, then we might be seeing signs or emerging signs of an arms race between the US and China. There is no so-called systemic arms race that goes all across the spectrum of various capabilities. And of course, it is complicated by the fact that some capabilities are interdependent with each other, right? So let's give an example of the naval realm. I think right now we have seen this current stage where China is building up on its quantity. Because when we talk about arms race, then we talk about two aspects of arms race, right? So one is quantity and the other one is quality. Now, China's initial approach to trying to sort of, catch up with the Americans is to modernize its obsolete fleet. I mean, we're talking about the surface combatant fleet, we're talking about the submarines, and of course, adding into, it is the aircraft carrier. And over the past 3-4 years or so, and there is a Chinese saying they call, putting dumplings into the pot to sort of describe how quickly they could churn out new warships. And we have in the recent years seen the Chinese outpacing the Americans in terms of the number of new warships being put into water, being launched or being commissioned in 1 year. And the US is behind that. And of course, to add on to that complication is that the US Navy is on average around, we talk about the age of the hull of each warship is on the average, say 20 to 30 years old. Whereas for the Chinese, we're looking at, less than 10 years old for its new ships in total. And if we put that aside, then we have to consider that in other areas, the Chinese were trying to play catch up with the Americans in various areas. I mean, air-to-air warfare, anti-surface warfare, and now increasingly in anti-submarine warfare. And these are, what we see as concurrent signs of those races, both on the quantitative side and on the qualitative side. But then again, it's important to note one thing. The US Navy so far remains a global navy. The Chinese Navy at this point of time is aspiring to be a blue water navy. And of course, in the future, it may become a global navy. But it is certainly more confined to its regional waters, which also means that it has a much more limited area of responsibility when it comes to the use of its naval forces. So these are comparing, the US and China when it comes to their naval buildup in this instance is not necessarily comparing, apples to apples or orange to orange. We need to consider all the host of other factors altogether. But suffice to say is that it's not just in the naval realm, but also in other realms, we are seeing these concurrent, signs of both the qualitative and quantitative so-called race, or if I could use a much more moderate term, is a competition that is actually taking place. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with you that the Chinese seems to be taking their time. They're not in a rush. I think that the year of consequence will be 2050, right? Where they say they will build a world-class military. Richard, any comment? And also, if there is an arms race between the great powers, isn't this bad news for Southeast Asia? Because there's no way we are going to compete at that scale, and nor do we want to. Yeah. So what should ASEAN countries do? Pak Andi talked about regional arms control. I remember Foreign Minister Ali Alatas, the late foreign minister, he once said that the key to peace in the region would be lower levels of armaments, and obviously that's not happening today. Yeah. But first, what do you think about the arms race and impact on Southeast Asia?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dino, for that question. Again, it's always a pleasure to be with you folks at the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. Thank you very much, Jenny, for arranging this. And it's lovely to be always with Colin and of course, good new friends with Pak Andi. They covered already all the important basic stuff. But let me add on this issue of arms race from 3 different perspectives. First of all, if you look at the spending, defense spending, including Southeast Asia during the pandemic, right? When a lot of countries actually suffered economic decline, and yet defense spending patterns are quite interesting. The second is the AUKUS, because I think AUKUS is the most dramatic expression of at least a discussion of an arms buildup in the region, although of course we know some side exaggerate the implications of that, and let's see whether the Australians will put it off. And lastly, actually building up on this discussions a while ago, this probability of having more Sputnik moments in China, right, that could completely overhaul and upend what we believed was, the Americans had still some time, right? That could completely change with new advents in technological innovations. The first thing is, interestingly, of course, we saw many countries suffering massive economic decline over the past 2 years or so, or at least in the first year of the pandemic. Countries like the Philippines, 10% GDP reduction, India around 9%, Indonesia more than 3%. And yet, if you look at defense spending in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, it remains steady. And I think that tells you something about priorities and anxieties in the region. Now, if you look at countries like Japan and Taiwan especially, there was actually a massive increase in terms of their defense spending trajectory. And in the case of Taiwan, of course, it's a very sensitive situation amid the rise of tensions in the region. And many are already talking about whether Taiwan is the next Ukraine, right? So I think this is something that we have to pay attention to. Why are countries ramping up their defense spending even when the economies are not doing so well? So perhaps that gives us some window into the threat perception dynamics in the region. The second thing is the AUKUS situation, because I think that is where it showed fault lines and confusions within ASEAN. So we had some friends, I think, from Malaysia who were quite critical openly of AUKUS, both the prime minister and also the foreign minister. There are even discussions of maybe we have to talk to our Chinese friends and see what they have to say about this. The word consultation was thrown out. Indonesia, there was slightly critical statement first, but I think Defense Minister Prabowo later on in the IISS forum quite clarified that they respect the choice of Australia on this particular issue, because Australia has also announced massive buildup in its defense spending in the coming decades. But then you look at countries like Vietnam and Singapore. I mean, the way I see it is it was kind of like an oblique statement, but deep inside you could say perhaps there's a higher level of tolerance or acceptance of the new dynamics there. Although, of course, we have leaders of Singapore and all opposing consistently a Cold War. Then you go to countries like Philippines, whereby at least the foreign minister openly said, hello, yes, if China is going to build up all of these capabilities, we need our near friends, meaning Australia, to do something about it, right? Although, of course, a few days later on, Duterte did his usual pro-China shenanigans. But the fact of the matter is that the defense establishment in some of the countries in ASEAN are comfortable with this. This is it. We are already in an arms race. If we cannot do it ourselves, we'd rather have some of our near allies pull the weight, right? And lastly, the idea of Sputnik moments. Now, I think Dr. Harari, the guy who writes on Homo Deus and all of that, he had a very interesting article on The Atlantic about how the 21st century will be the complete opposite of the 20th century in terms of the impact of technology and data management. So in the 20th century, a lot of Nobel Prize winners were people who proved that democracies and capitalism in general, democratic capitalism, are more effective than authoritarian regimes because they have spontaneous management of data. And that explains why the Soviet Union collapsed, because it has a centralized management system versus the American capitalist system. Now, the interesting argument right now is that the 21st century is going to be the opposite, precisely because of the introduction of artificial intelligence and some new dynamics whereby the more you can collect data, the easier you can improve your algorithmic sciences, your predictive capabilities, and also your ability to engage in next generation innovation. And the Black Mirror situation we're seeing in China, where there's no privacy law in any serious sense of the word, right, is giving China a lot of edge that a lot of Western countries do not have. And in fact, in the military realm, we're seeing more and more of this, what you call Sputnik moments, already with the hypersonic missiles. And I think recently we had this weird report that it seems the Americans are now trying to steal Chinese engineers to help them with hypersonic. So we have reverse tech, theft and espionage, which is quite astonishing. And the reality is this: yes, the Chinese are actually catching up on the conventional front. We talk a lot about Daifeng asymmetric capabilities of China, anti-carrier killer capabilities. But for heaven's sakes, the Chinese now have 2 operational 5th generation fighter. Maybe not at the same level as Americans, but they're almost getting ahead of the Russians, right? Which is quite an interesting and fascinating development, right? But now we see that the Chinese are also operating at the cutting edge of the Sputnik moments development. Hypersonic, they could be even ahead of the Americans already. So this is where I think the earlier projections about US will have a military edge for the next generation, economy-wise, China is going to catch up soon. I think now we have to revisit a lot of those assumptions, because just the nature of technological innovation is changing the very physics of power. Now, how is it relevant to us in ASEAN? I think these are both depressing and exciting times to be a student of ASEAN, right? Because I remember back in 1990s and 2000s when I was a student. I'm not that old, I'm a millennial, older millennial. We were very excited about ASEAN. Constructivism was the framework that really influenced a lot of us. And I'm still influenced by constructivism. I'm a recovering constructivist in my understanding of international relations in many ways. But the reality right now, geopolitics is back with a vengeance, right? And that is going to present very stark choices for ASEAN. So whether we're going to operate together or some of the ASEAN countries are going to go full middle power and deal with this issue on their own terms, I think these are going to be the tough choices we're going to face. Clearly, Indonesia and potentially Malaysia and and Vietnam are in a position to become middle powers on their own. So let's see what's going to be the dynamic on that front. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let me come back to Andy, and I would like to get Colin and Richard's comment on this as well. When I look at arms race, now I'm looking at several components. There seems to be greater competition on missiles development, right? There seems to be more emphasis on cyber, which is something new. I think it wasn't there 20, 30 years ago. And also on space, President Xi Jinping and Putin just made an announcement on that they wish that's not going to happen, but it seems like that's going to happen. And also submarines. This was highlighted by the AUKUS development recently. There's so much row about Australia developing nuclear powered submarines. But I think it's also a prediction that China will also develop something like 50 nuclear powered submarines by 2050, right? So I just want to know, and also aircraft carriers. I think India and China is getting more and more of aircraft carriers. So I'm just wondering, are these correctly the features of the arms race that we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific? Pak Andi.
What you describe as the coming of new military technology will be the character of future war, maybe in the next 20 or 30 years. But those technologies are not mature enough to be launched in the near-term war. So I still believe that the way we fight our battle today will be almost the same like the way we fight our battle. The tactic will be almost the same in 1980s, maybe even during the World War II, the Second World War. It's still the same. For example, let us analyze deeply the military deployment of Russia in the border of Ukraine. The military tactic is almost the same. The use of tank, for example, artillery, infantry, the deployment of fighter jet, and so on. The tactic is still almost the same. We are seeing the coming of new technology, but I don't think they are mature enough to be used in the near future terms. The problem with the new technology, of course, it will depend on the capability of each country to adopt the new technology in its military organization, and that will not be easy. For example, if China try to adopt let's say the hypersonic missile, for example, they had to change drastically the structure of their military organization to be able to adopt the new type of technology. For example, the US in the Trump era in 2018, Trump created new army command. They call it military multi-domain operation within the army. The head of this MDO, multi-domain operation army command, is 4-star general. But this MDO command will be ready to change or to be launched into new army tactical operation in 2028. So the MDO will study, will evaluate the new concept of MDO for the US Army, and it will be ready in the next 10 years, 2028. So I think yes, there is a new technology coming in defense organization, but I don't think there will be significant change drastically in the near future that we will see in our region.
Colin, are we going to see where would be the next aircraft, the next new aircraft carriers coming from?
Yeah. Hi. I think so far most of the attention is on China because China has made quite substantial progress when it comes to its aircraft carrier program. If you recall, the first carrier came about in September 2012. That was basically an old Ukrainian hull that was modified and further refurbished. And of course, the second one that is considered the first ever locally built carrier that is based on the Liaoning was on the same model, and that was essentially another ski jump type carrier. But the third one that is possibly going to come out this year because existing evidences, including pictures available, indicated that the ship is in final stages of construction. And of course, it does take quite a bit of time, as usual, for the state builders trials and all that. So, it's going to come this year and very likely may feature new technology. And it might potentially mean that it is the definitive model for China when it comes to building aircraft carriers. So if you look at the patterns of how China goes about with its naval shipbuilding industry, is basically going through various iterations of the model, and then once they are settled on a successful model, they finalize it, and that will become the mass production model. So this third carrier, which is the second locally built carrier, will have a conventional layout that is not entirely different from the US super carrier. And in fact, some of the evidences seem to show that the size of this new carrier is almost on par with the Nimitz class or even the newer Ford class that the US Navy has. And of course, that is besides the point. I mean, I do agree with Pak Andi, because if you are talking about, the infusion of new technology in today and the future combat scenario, which may not necessarily differ from the old techniques that we saw in the past, what we may see will be, certain technologies that will become decisive as force multiplier. Aircraft carriers being one of them, and that gives China some sort of parity with what the US is doing. But at the end of the day, when we look at this whole idea of arms race, we do need to take a step back and try to ask ourselves, in the midst of all this build-up, what really matters is whether those military organizations that we are concerned about, are they able to so-called induct those capabilities, absorb them properly, and thereby are there corresponding changes to the force structure, and how do those various services and armed branches work together for what we call a joint format. So I think that is probably something that really matters. But I think so far, when we are so bogged down with the numbers, we tend to not look at these tangible or semi-tangible factors in the arms build-up. Thank you.
Okay. South China Sea. I want to ask Richard, and if Andy or Colin wants to chip in later, feel free. To what extent are we seeing militarization in the South China Sea? Militarization of presence of the claimant countries there.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Dina, let me just pitch into the debate. I think I'm not necessarily disagreeing here, but I think the deployment of drone warfare, especially in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, and more recently we saw also the Ethiopian government's deployment of drone from some of the Middle Eastern countries recently. We saw that how revolutionary that could be. It changed really the dynamics of the war. I really suggest folks go online, even on YouTube. You can check how the Armenian massive conventional forces were completely outflanked by these Turkish drones, right? That the Azerbaijani forces were using. And for many, that could be a test case or a foretaste of the wars to come. I mean, can you imagine if you build a huge, massive unmanned kind of AI-driven drones. And even aircraft carriers could be very, very vulnerable to that. So I think there are countries like China who can afford to move on multiple fronts, conventional, asymmetric, Sputnik moment, all at the same time. But there are going to be a lot of middle powers or smaller powers who may opt to more focus on development of asymmetric capabilities. And interestingly, we see, for instance, Turkey emerging as a kind of a drone superpower. So for me, studying that case study, Armenia, Azerbaijan, I think could give us some insights about what could come next. Right now, of course, that could have implications also here in South China Sea. Right, recently the Philippines got the BrahMos missile, cruise missile, supersonic missile from the Indians. Well, of course, a lot of friends were making a joke out of it that, hey, look at the defense system of the Chinese; it's already twice the Mach speed, right? But the reality is that this is just going to be the icebreaker, right? Countries like the Philippines and others in Southeast Asia could be in position to get the BrahMos 2, which is a hypersonic missile capability, maybe not too long in the future, right? So I think many countries are moving in that direction. So we may see the impact of these new revolutions in military technology also in the South China Sea. Now, overall, I mean, let's just be honest about what happened in the South China Sea. Clearly, the Chinese took everyone by surprise, or many people did not respond the way they should have, including the Americans. I think the Obama administration was really caught off guard. So from 2030 and essentially all the way to, let's say, 2021, 2022, China's had the upper hand, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the case forever. I mean, I come from a country of boxers, right? One of our boxers want to even become a president. I would say this is still round 4 or round 5, and there's no knockout yet. Maybe a knockdown here and there. This is a long fight. Vietnamese friends still have more than 24 land features there. Philippines is holding on to as many as it can. Our Malaysian friends have their stuff. You Indonesians are getting indirectly pulled in because of the situation in the North Natuna Sea. A lot can still change in the South China Sea, but clearly China took the advantage, took the initiative from 2013 to 2022, and we're going to pay a price for that. But I think there's still time to respond. So I never bought these fatalistic arguments that I used to hear from some of the Western capitals, including from some friends down under who talked about, hey, let's just forget about first island chain and then let's focus. I'm glad those kinds of stuff are out. Now, Australia is now in a completely different direction. That shows how things can dramatically change in geopolitics. Because one of the problems we have is that we make projections about the next 20 years, but that presupposes that the political foundation of these military calculations will remain the same. I mean, the last time China ruled the seas during the Ming dynasties, we saw how it suddenly ended, right? When suddenly the Ming emperor said, hey, let's focus on something else. Now Xi Jinping is all in on conventional military capability buildup, etc. But we don't know about China. So I think the politics, domestic politics, is also something that we have to take into consideration, including on the future direction of the South China Sea. But just on the last point on this, we clearly see now that there's a bipartisan consensus in the US that there should be a tough, robust presence in the area. In fact, by some measures, if you look at the deployment of major warships to the area, Biden is now beating Trump. Biden is more Trump than Trump right now in terms of deployment numbers in the South China Sea, which is the complete opposite of what we were hearing from a lot of friends saying, oh, the Democrats are going to be softy and dovish on China. That's not happening because this is a bipartisan consensus. So this is a new permanent feature of the South China Sea dynamics that I think we in Southeast Asia have to take into calculus. Of course, in Philippines, many are happy about that. Go, we need more American help. But I'm sure there are other ASEAN countries who may have second thoughts.
Yeah. Colin, before I turn to Pak Andi to ask about Indonesia's growing defense budgets, but Colin, I want to ask you on the South China Sea militarization. Is it realistic for any of us to hope for a moratorium of militarization in the South China Sea?
Yeah, thank you, Park. I think the whole topic of militarization itself is a contested term, right? Because there is so far no agreement amongst the various concerned parties in the South China Sea when it comes to the word militarization. Now, for example, if you look at the June 2018 draft single tax treaty, right, and on the Code of Conduct, and you'll find that only Vietnam is the only party inside that borders to try to define what militarization is about. And I think many other parties are trying to shy away from that because they do not want to get unnecessarily embroiled into something that is too complex, right? If we do not have any consensus on how we define militarization, which, for example, will include down the entire spectrum, say, the very straightforward build-up of military forces around, or you talk about, Coast Guards adopting a more militarized posture, or you just simply talk about building structures on the artificial island outposts. All these could qualify as militarization, but if you ask different people, they'll tell you that's not militarization, that is my defensive preparation, and the other party is doing militarization. Whatever I'm doing is not militarization. I think this is a conceptual problem that has real policy implication for now. So I don't think it's possible to even think about a moratorium. Unfortunately, I believe in the South China Sea right now, we have reached a point which is quite unlike back in the 1990s or early 2000s perhaps, where the countries, I don't believe, are willing to give up their current vantage position, whichever position they are now having right now. If you talk about China, China is not likely to yield to that. And then the whole issue here is, if you want to have a moratorium, then who is going to be involved, right? Is it going to be just the South China Sea parties? Or how do you think about the roles of the extra-regional powers? Are they going to be involved in this moratorium, and will they agree to that, right? So I think this is a very complicated situation when we talk about attempts to try to, reduce risk in the South China Sea. And I think for now, the code of conduct situation, which I don't think we move very much from the 2018 SDNT. I don't think we have moved much really into the real game of confidence and security building measures amongst the parties in the area. Thank you.
Yeah. I just want a quick follow-up to that. Sorry, after this, I go to Pak Andi. I remember Bilahari in one seminar said that even if the code of conduct is achieved in the South China Sea, the structure of military power relations is just so uneven that could undermine the code of conduct itself. Yeah. So if one of the biggest claimant says this is what we're going to do militarily, then practically there's nothing the others ASEAN claimants can do. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Dino. My main beef with the code of conduct, I mean, since you raised these, I think it's very timely, and I use the opportunity to build on that, is, everybody seems to be so hung up about whether the code of conduct should be legally binding or otherwise. To me, that is not the real crux of the problem. The real crux of the problem, if you could agree on some of the other issues like geographical scope, as well as who is signing on it, for example, I think the bigger issue here is, how do you ensure that the signatories will comply with all those rules, and failing which, is there a way to verify whether they violate those rules? And having succeeded in verifying whether they have violated those rules, is there a way to enforce any penalties on the violators without what we call the CVE instruments in this type of thing? Basically, any party within these code of conduct can do whatever they want based on their national interest. Let me give you one hypothetical scenario. Say, for example, 2 years later, we sign the code of conduct in whatever form, right? And the next thing is, we don't have the US or the other extra-regional powers being a signatory to it. The US is still going to do whatever it wants to do. For example, freedom of navigation operation. The next thing, China will start to build up again. And then when we ask China, why are you building up again, is in contravention to that. And China will say it's because of the US, right? So I think we face this situation where, very easily these codes can fall apart because we lack the CVE instruments in that sense. So I don't think it's just China, but basically this entire code can be very easily lent to abuse by any party. Thank you.
Okay. Pak Andi, I think 2021 last year was unique because that was the year that the Indonesian government decided to significantly increase its defense budget. Yeah, I was wondering if we can just give throughout ASEAN there are very few countries that are doing that. Yeah, I think the Philippine budget has been reduced, and if you look at the Thailand or the Vietnamese or Malaysian budget or Singapore budget, it remains more or less constant. Yeah, can you give us an explanation of what is behind the significant rise of defense budget, and how do we do it in a way that tells all the other ASEAN countries that you don't need to worry about this?
Yeah, I think in terms of absolute number in dollar or rupiah term, yeah, we can argue that there is a significant increase in Indonesia defense budget. But if we look at more closely to, for example, the proportion of defense budget to our GDP, then we realize that basically Indonesia defense budget is remained the same from 2006 until now. It's still around 0.7 until 0.8% to our GDP. So it is a constant stagnant defense budget for the last 15 years. Yeah, when Pak Prabowo last year announced his strategic planning until 2044, yeah, to cover 20 years of our defense modernization. Actually, the proportion of defense budget to our GDP is still maintained at 0.8%. So there is no significant increase in terms of that. With only allocate 0.8% of our GDP to our defense budget, it means that basically Indonesia is planning to maintain its current force, yeah, maybe to modernize its obsolete weapon system, but Indonesia doesn't have will not have any significant breakthrough, for example, to do modernization plus or to increase to arms build up. So I think arms maintenance until at least 2040 is still the main focus of Indonesia Defense Ministry. That's why our defense budget is still relatively moderate at 0.8% of our GDP.
Yeah. Would you agree that what is different these days is that the military development of the TNI is much less worried about fighting internal insurgencies, which was the focus in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so on. So they can afford to have a more strategic outlook on their military development beyond fighting domestic insurgencies. Yeah. Do you think is that a correct way of looking at it?
Yeah, that's one of the main reason of our new strategic plan for our defense modernization. It is started in 2006 when Pak SBY, Pak Juwono Sudarsono, initiated the strategic plan of 2024. Yeah. So Pak Prabowo, our defense minister right now, has to complete the third phase of our 2024 strategic plan. Then after that, we have to reevaluate the strategic plan and make sure that there will be continuation to modernize our weapon system until 2044. But it is still not decided by our government, but we still have to wait whether or not in the next 6 months, Pak Jokowi and Pak Prabowo will come up with a new strategic planning for the next 20 years.
Okay, good. Let me go back to AUKUS, and there has been questions or concerns that this will lead to a new nuclear arms race and so on. How valid or invalid is this concern? Yeah, maybe Colin or Richard, if you want to comment on that. Yeah, or Pandi also. Yeah.
Right. Again, I raised that issue because I think that showed some fundamental issues and problems in ASEAN. I mean, let's just be honest. we should become, at the very least, a kind of what, Lee Kuan Yew called the poison shrimp, or have a porcupine strategy, right? But the problem in ASEAN is that we're more like an ostrich, right? We want to pretend that a problem is not there. We refuse to call a spade a spade. And, a lot of friends in Canberra and all were raising their eyebrows, not only about the French, who kind of overreacted all over the place, what do you expect? But the fact that a lot of these Southeast Asian countries who were bashing AUKUS, right, all these officials, were completely mum when reports of China's hypersonic missile capability came out. We're completely mum when China was building up its submarine capabilities in Hainan. And we know where these submarines of China are going. So that's the problem. We had this ostrich effect whereby some people just want to pretend there's no problem, or just focus on bashing those who they believe will not bite back and rather avoid criticizing the other side. So this is the problem we have in ASEAN. And when we talk about ASEAN, let's be also honest. If we're talking about the organization of ASEAN, let me go a little bit Bilahari on this. I mean, he had some controversial things to say about EU as Soviet Union without human rights. I mean, ASEAN is essentially a small and medium enterprise without human rights. Its budget is very limited. Its organizational capability is very limited. So at some point, we need ASEAN minilateralism. Key countries within ASEAN have to coordinate, get things together. I mean, thank goodness we're doing some stuff to make sure that in dealing with Myanmar, we're not going to go off the rail. And I'm glad that our Cambodian friends, I know the Khmer Times kind of wrote something against me recently, but let me tell you, to our Cambodian friends, I'm all support. And I'm glad that the key members in ASEAN are making sure we're on the right track on Myanmar. Why not we do the same thing on South China Sea and other issues? This is the issue I have. And just to go back to the issue of code of conduct, I rather have no code of conduct than a code of conduct that is legally binding with Chinese characteristics, right? A legally binding code of conduct that gives China prerogative on what on earth we can do within South China Sea, whether drilling with Western companies, whether military drills with our Western allies and friends. That is not the kind of COC I want. So I think that ASEAN is having an existential moment here. And I think minilateralism is the best way to save ASEAN from the deficiencies of its multilateralism. So this is relevant because how on earth can we talk about putting a regulation on next generation, very dangerous, potentially destructive arms race if we cannot even deal with the very basic issue of code of conduct, which has been there with us forever? What are we waiting for? Are we obsessed with the cult of discourse, or do we really want to get something done? And I think this is where this is an existential moment for us in ASEAN. There's nothing inherently ineffective with ASEAN. We saw during the Cambodian stabilization in the 1990s, during the East Timor transition, ASEAN stepped up to the plate. There was a lot of effectiveness on the part of ASEAN. So we need a new generation of great leaders and diplomats in ASEAN to step it up also in dealing with this. Otherwise, we're just going to be not innocent, but not necessarily innocent, but we're going to be the victims and bystanders of a very dangerous escalation in this part of the world.
Yeah, Colin, you reply to that?
Yeah, I think I don't have very much to disagree with what my good friend Richard has said. We respond to AUKUS. I thought, okay, in general, I agree about the ostrich mentality. And sometimes being an ostrich may be a good thing. Sometimes it's not, right? And what was interesting is that for all the rhetoric that came out after September last year when AUKUS was announced, what's interesting is that it didn't really last very long, to be honest. There are a few very interesting signs we see after that. First is that there were indications that the Chinese were trying to sort of rally, the Southeast Asian governments to try to band together to oppose AUKUS. There was these publicized meeting by the senior Chinese MFA official with the ambassadors of ASEAN, certainly talking about AUKUS, but there is no joint statement whatsoever. And there was no follow-up statements from any of these ASEAN countries that appear to back up China's position. So that is one. Second is that, not long after AUKUS, there was the ASEAN-Australia summit, and the relationship was elevated into a comprehensive strategic partnership that to me doesn't seem to be a reboot at Australia, to be honest, right? And of course, not to mention that not long after AUKUS, Indonesia, despite the rhetoric about AUKUS, continued with a major naval exercise with Australia, and Malaysia signed a cybersecurity pact with with Australia as well. Not to mention that they also engage in other bilateral exercises with the US and the UK. So I see that, you know, that rhetoric is important. In a way, it is meant to, you know, satisfy domestic audience. Is also meant to in some way signal to China that we are saying something. But when it comes to the real deeds on the ground, you know, that doesn't appear to me to be, you know, pro-Beijing when it comes to AUKUS or in any way anti-AUKUS in that sense. Yeah, thanks so much for that.
Okay, I want to now talk about the recent announcement or this recent meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Putin. They met in Beijing, then they issued a declaration. Andy, do you see this as a response somewhat to AUKUS? And do you see there is clear strategic alignment between Russia and China now, resulting from the Putin-Xi Jinping meeting? And also, do you see a future of more intense military cooperation between China and Russia?
Yeah, I think the political and defense maneuver made by US in our region will force especially China to find a more reliable ally to counterbalance the US presence in this region. Yeah, and Russia, of course, will be the natural ally for China. Yeah, different, for example, with Indonesia. That I always say that Indonesia has a kind of doctrinal or strategic entrapment. Yeah, two sources of strategic entrapment of Indonesia. The first one is the doctrine of the foreign policy doctrine, yeah, free and active doctrine. For me, that's one of source of the entrapment. The second one is the defense doctrine of people and total warfare. Yeah, that's another entrapment. The guerrilla warfare, that's another entrapment. So Indonesia will not be able to significantly shift its strategy, yeah, to counter balance, for example, the recent US movement to Australia, the recent China militarization in South China Sea, and so on, because there is a very, very strong psychological strategic culture blockade, yeah, in our defense establishment. Yeah. Due to that factor, I think China must rely to other country like Russia to counterbalance the presence of the United States in the region.
Okay, Richard, what's your take on the Xi Jinping Putin meeting? I read the joint declaration, and I was quite intrigued that their pledge to cooperate is also mixed with a vision of a new world order. Yeah, and there was quite a lot that was quite critical of the West. I think the implication is that we don't want the status quo, and you know, we want to work together to challenge that. And do you think also it is sustainable? Because you know, I hear a lot from seminars or from private conversations, that Russia-China strategic cooperation is just not going to be durable. You know, there's just too many holes. Yeah. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, a lot of us used to be dismissive about this Russia-China axis. I mean, so a lot of people said it's an axis of convenience, but now it's increasingly becoming an axis of desperation, right? Especially on one side, right? And if you go really through the notes, what's interesting there to see is how, I'm not saying Russia is the junior partner all out, but you can see there's a lot of part that says we support China's initiatives here, initiatives there. Like you can see a lot, it's a very long statement. You go through it, there's a lot of mention of China's initiatives, which clearly shows who's the more senior partner in this axis. Maybe the Russians are fine with that now, And Russia, so far, its economy is not that dependent on China. So it went from around 10% of export trade share to around 20%. By the way, Russia has a lot of trade surplus with China because of massive energy exports. But I think 10, 15 years down the road, Russia could end up in a very tricky situation of more and more dependence on China. So I think Putin's calculation is that for now, it's still overall mutually beneficial. Neither of us is too dependent on each other. And by the way, for now, our focus is to get our agenda on the table, whether it's to make sure the Ukrainians are not going to be on a path to either EU or NATO. And sometimes I actually wonder whether Putin is more worried about Ukraine joining EU or NATO. And I would sometimes say EU perhaps is more important than NATO, despite all the rhetoric. And on the case of China, they really want to make sure they get their initiative an upper hand when it comes to Taiwan, right? But my sense is really when push comes to shove, should a war happen in Ukraine, God forbid, or a war happen in Taiwan, God forbid, each of these powers are going to act on their own. So I don't think it's going to be a full-fledged alliance in any way. It's just it's an alliance of convenience that has gone into an alliance of desperation temporarily, but let's see where it goes. Now, the last thing I want to say on this, China and Russia, they tend to emphasize this need for more multipolarity, right? Which I definitely agree with. But if there's multipolarities mean essentially three superpowers calling the shot, a tripolarity, and all of us are essentially the middle powers and the rest nobodies, I'm not happy with that kind of multipolarity. In fact, the new term that is being now used is pluripolarity, right? A much more pluralistic polarity, rather just a few superpowers calling the shot. Because if you read between the lines, it's kind of saying we are two big giants, US is the other big giants, let's just essentially have a condominium there in the world. They're not saying it openly, but I can kind of read that in between the lines. And if you're ASEAN, if you're a middle power, you're not happy with this situation. So as much as we don't want an American-dominated world, because no one wants a unipolar moment anymore, I hope that the multipolarity we're moving towards is not one of Russia, China, and US, each of them having their own spheres of influence, essentially three Monroe doctrines around the world. We want others to step up to the plate. So we hope that our European friends, we hope that ASEAN down the road can have more say in shaping the security architecture in their relevant regions.
Actually, I want to follow up on that. Maybe Pak Colin or Pak Andi can reply. The European countries have come up with their Indo-Pacific strategies. Yeah? EU has an Indo-Pacific paper. France also, Germany, and I believe the UK also, and perhaps more will come up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Does that mean that it is inevitable that we're going to see more naval or military presence of European countries in the Indo-Pacific? Is that inevitable, or it doesn't necessarily mean that? Anyone want to comment? Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Dino. I think so far, what I see will be not a concerted EU approach when it comes to military presence in the region. At least in so far, we are talking about the deployment of assets into the region. I think that is still down to the individual EU member states. And we are going to very likely be confined to only a few EU member states because of their ability to, do this due to their resources. But at the very least, if we put aside, military presence in the region and we define it so broadly, then we can see the EU potentially playing a role in other aspects of capacity building in Southeast Asia. For example, it doesn't necessarily have to mean showing the big naval flag out in the middle of the sea. It could mean, trying to train up personnel in the various capitals, for instance. But there again, what we have here at the very least is, going right into the next 5 years, there will be, a pair of offshore patrol vessels from the UK that will be deployed to the region. And in the next 5 years, we may see newer, more capable vessels coming in. But the UK is very likely going to be one of the few European powers that will have a more permanent, visible presence in this part of the world. But then again, I will always try to convince myself that end of the day, it is always your own homeland and your surrounding neighborhood that matters more. So end of the day, if the European security situation keeps evolving the way it is right now with Ukraine and the tensions with Russia, I don't think the EU or the member states are in any viable position to think about a more permanent military presence in this part of the world. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but isn't it true that we are, the region, Southeast Asia, is inevitably facing a future of geostrategic condensation with the Chinese blue water navy, and more submarines, more aircrafts from aircraft carriers from India, from Russia, Japan, Australia, UK and France, and so on. We're going to see a lot more traffic into our waters, and leading to what I said earlier, geostrategic condensation. How should ASEAN, as you know, this is our home, yeah? How should we respond to this, or is there nothing that we can do to prevent that or to control it? Yeah. Right.
Yeah, Park Dino, thanks so much. I'll follow up on what you have just said. If you could ask me, very bluntly speaking, for all the talk about we are trying to maintain centrality in the regional architecture, the very real matter of fact is that there is no way we can actually control, whether they will come in or not, in what type of strength, how often they want to come, and all that. So at the very most, is we are able to at least raise some concerns collectively through the various summits and the other joint statements that we have, and to try to remind them. I think the word reminder is probably the better word to use, that we remind them that while they carry on their activities in the region, that the way they want it to be, it is important for them to avoid escalating situation. And that is not just a political consideration we are thinking about, but we are also talking about down to the operational level. It's very much up to the professionalism of the military operators on the ground to interact with each other professionally and safely, for example, in the high seas or in somebody else's EEZ. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is about Andy. This is my last question before I open up a question to the audience. And by Richard, if you want to respond to this, by all means. So, a lot of my American friends, when I attend military briefings, when I serve there, I always hear this: the United States is not interested in a small competitive advantage with regard to our rivals or our competitors. We want a total advantage. We don't want to leave any chance. We want a total domination over our enemies or competitors on the military sphere. We want the highest maximum chance of victory, right? So when I hear that, and I see that China is already having a $250 billion defense budget, which is about 1/3 of the US just above 700 billion. And China's defense will keep rising, obviously. Does that mean that we're going to see a lot more American, defense budgets, rising in order to prevent China from gaining any, advantage or close the gap with the US? Pandi?
Yeah, I think, but if we, for example, use Paul Kennedy framework of the rise and fall of great power, the problem of the United States right now is, exactly two main variable of the fall of great power: imperial overstretch and the lack of innovation. So if the US cannot deal with these two causes, then I think we are going to see a significant progress to hegemonic transition in our region. As Pauline before stated, if we compare US and China naval presence in the region, then China will only focus on deploying its naval forces to one specific spot, South China Sea. Whereas United States must focus in Pacific Ocean, Atlantic, now focus on Crimean and so on. So there is a problem of imperial overstretch of the US. Yeah, the only way for the great power to deal with this imperial overstretch is by innovation. Yeah, of course, innovation, it means they have to increase significantly the capacity of their research. So they will have a technological breakthrough that will again dominate the balance of power in terms of weapon system vis-a-vis China.
Richard, will the U.S. try its best to maintain the distance, the gap, or what will it do? Regarding China,
yeah, the doctrine of full spectrum hegemony or dominance is so 1990s and Bush administration, right? And I think Clinton had it correct back in the 1990s when he said, while you're in position of power, prepare for a world where you're no longer the number one, right? And I think the Biden administration has kind of understood that. Hence, I'm sure Colin and Pak Andy can also pitch on this, the notion of integrated deterrence. It's still kind of fuzzy, but I think at the very core, it means we're entering an era whereby US alone cannot do the, lifting, right? We need other people to pitch in. There's just no way we can do it. Now, the problem is, who are going to be the lieutenants here? Is it going to be Australia? Will the French ever accept to be just the lieutenants? That's where the problem is. But I think there's a recognition by the Biden administration that forget about that, the full spectrum dominance. We're entering a world whereby China alone can match us on so many levels. The Sputnik moments will even put them ahead of us. 5G network, they're already ahead of the US. So that's an illusion. That's an imperial illusion. And the US has to be realistic and focus on integrated deterrence. Now, I think that is a polite and I would say, stealthy way of admitting we're never going to go back to the full spectrum dominance we had. And in certain areas, US is actually already behind the Chinese, right? So let's be realistic. And that is where I think not ASEAN as a whole, but some key countries in Southeast Asia will be very important to the United States. So this is where I talk about minilateralism plus. There are many areas whereby key countries in ASEAN can work together with the Americans, but there are also areas we can work with the Chinese, right? Where if Americans become Trumpian again, which is very possible in another 2 years, right? So I think this is really the future, this dynamic equilateral balancing through unilateral arrangements and all, and creating our own squad, right? There's Quad, but the Quad will need help. So there could be elements, not only Singapore, but other countries in ASEAN who could be helpful on certain issues. I mean, just to close on this, I mean, my latest book, I'm going to get out one soon again on China. My closing chapter was on the notion of rhizomatic networks. If you look at how the physics of power in the 21st century, it's as hierarchical as it may seem. The problems we're going to face are so overwhelming in technological disruption, climate change, etc., that at some point, US, China alone will not be sufficient to deal with these issues. So you really need minilateral, cross-cutting, flexible, cooperative arrangements to deal with them. I know this sounds fuzzy, but as climate change and other problems get very serious, all this Cold War style kind of discussion, in my opinion, will be secondary. We want everyone to pitch in. We want everyone to help. And we need very flexible patterns of cooperation. So I think we need some also theoretical innovations in how we discuss geopolitics, because it's still very hierarchical understanding of geopolitics when the very physics of power changing. Sorry, I know there are a lot of students, so I hope they appreciate the rhizomatic rather than hierarchical approach to geopolitics. And that's where I'm more optimistic about ASEAN and key ASEAN countries play a more important role in the region, precisely because we're also going to be very vulnerable to a lot of this crisis. And we need to get all the help we can, right? Before we go into this don't look up situation of complete hopelessness.
Okay, I want to take 3 questions from the audience. One is from Nikkei. Nikkei Asia asks, I think Pak Andi is best suited to answer this. If Indonesia move its capital to East Kalimantan, how will that affect the geopolitical situation around the South China Sea? Given expectations of larger Indonesian military presence nearer to the sea with the capital move. So that's for Andy. And for Richard, there is a question about from Raytham. What are from LPU? What are the chances that the US would try to affect the upcoming Philippine elections to secure a better foothold in the South China Sea? Is having a bigger US presence good for the sovereignty of ASEAN countries? And Calvin from FPCI asks, I think for Colin, what do you say about the arms race or the race in the cyber space? Because we are talking about new players or different set of players. For example, North Korea is seen as a cyber superpower. Do you see a big gap developing in cyber capability? And is that a threat to Southeast Asia? So those three questions, first Pak Andi, and then Richard, and then Colin. Pak Andi.
Okay, thank you for the question regarding the new capital city in East Kalimantan. Of course, it will shift our center of gravity from Jakarta, Jawa, to the new Nusantara city in East Kalimantan. Right now, Indonesia government, especially defense minister and military headquarters, still preparing the military strategic planning of redeploying our troops due to the process of the movement of the capital city to the Kalimantan. Yeah, we realize that it will move us closer to our hot zone in Sulawesi Sea and also north of Natuna, but we are still debating, for example, of what will be the defense paradigm for defending our capital city. Yeah, Indonesia military doctrine or military history doesn't have any experience of capital city fortification. Yeah, so we do not have any military experience, any tactical experience of heavily defending capital city in 1945, 1949, our War of Independence, or during the separatist war in the 1950s. We did not have any experience of capital city fortification, so we have to reconsider other paradigm. It is the debate on fortification versus, for example, deep maneuver, fortification versus strategic mobilization, or fortification versus the PVIP evacuation. Yeah, it's still on the process here in Jakarta. And we also realize for redeploying our forces to Kalimantan, it will take at least 20 years to be completed. So it will be a long process before we see a significant change in our military deployment due to the rise of new capital city in East Kalimantan.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I know there are a lot of questions. I mean, I teach strategic history, and that's the question I expect to get when I'm discussing the Philippines in 1950s, right? When Americans could call the shot who will be our president. I think the issue now is more China. What is China going to do in these elections? And clearly, the Chinese are very happy with how the elections are going. This is the most China-friendly democracy we're seeing in the region. From a very pro-China Duterte, we may go to even a more disciplined pro-China Marcos very soon. So the Chinese are very happy with this situation, and I think increasingly the Americans are irrelevant in calling the shots compared to where they were in history. So yeah, I mean, if we're talking about 1950s, 60s, I definitely get the question. And the issue of sovereignty, well, I don't know. You can also ask the Japanese and Koreans who still host American bases. But what I can say is clearly, as far as strategic threats is concerned, U.S. is not the one trying to grab Philippine islands and fishermen and fishes and resources. We know what that power is. So I'll just be brutally frank about that.
Yeah, and any plans for Philippines to build an aircraft carrier?
Maybe that's where Americans can help us. But if we go the Thailand way, we might have Chinese submarines soon. Like that's something we have to look at.
Okay, Colin. Cyber, how much should we worry about the growing gap? Yeah, because the cyber powers are very different than conventional powers.
Yeah, thank you, Park Dino. I have to admit that I'm not a cyber expert, but I'm speaking based more from the geopolitical point of view and knowing roughly what Southeast Asian governments are capable of. Is that, unfortunately, we can all talk about the cyber race between the great powers like US, China, and Russia. They have substantial offensive cyber capabilities. But the problem here is that as we saw a very rapid pace of digital transformation throughout Southeast Asia, the unfortunate fact is that cybersecurity has not caught up in that respect. So I think even in the area of defensive cyber capability, Southeast Asian countries are still quite far behind in that the capabilities are unevenly spread out. And not to mention, we can forget about offensive cyber capabilities of our own. So I think this is something that requires Southeast Asian countries to look more into. Besides, the more tangible, big ticket military purchases, I think cyber is important in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, so there we see the 10 most powerful cyber nations: US, China, UK, Russia, Netherlands, France, Germany, Canada, Japan, and Australia. I'm surprised Singapore is not on this list, Colin. All right. Let me take more questions now. There is one from Dr. Salil. Interesting question about military modernizations and sustainability. I guess he's asking whether or not the military establishment in the Indo-Pacific plan or pay attention to climate change or decarbonization. Right. I'm actually quite aware that Pentagon has developed a defense strategy which takes into account climate change. Is this something that military planners should do? Anyone who wants to answer this? Colin, go ahead. Yeah.
Wow, I could take a jab. Thanks, Padino. I think you're right. The US government so far is the Pentagon so far is the only defense department that has a major plan that incorporates climate change as a consideration. But let's not forget that in other militaries around, while we do not have concerted strategies like what Pentagon has, there are some discrete measures undertaken that took climate change into account. I think one of which being, looking into green energy sources as such. And of course, the other conservation measures that were undertaken by the militaries to try to reduce the carbon footprint. But altogether, it appears, at least in this region, these efforts don't amount to much, unfortunately. So if anything, this might be one potential area for militaries, whether you are adversaries or their friends, it could be part of defense diplomacy going forward. Thank you.
Okay. There is a question from Dennis Jonathan. He asks, in the Indo-Pacific, there is no clear lines between either parties. He says that alliances between most Indo-Pacific nations, especially China and ASEAN, are non-existent. Does that make escalation easier? He is comparing this to the experience of during the Cold War, when there was a clear strategic lines between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. Yeah. So, does anyone want to answer that? Pak Andi, you're shaking your head. Yes.
Yeah, I think the lack of formal military alliance in our region, especially in Southeast Asia, make all the countries in this region must heavily rely to other mechanism. Yeah, of course, for Indonesia, we hope that ASEAN should be the but should play a central role in any conflict resolution mechanism in the region. But the lack of formal alliance in the region enable us, for example, to initiate measurement of arms control, such as within NATO or Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Yeah, it is not possible, for example, for us to launch initiative or non-provocative defense mechanism. Yeah, between countries. Yeah, for example, to have series of confidence building measure that relies on transparency of military activities between region. So we must rely to other mechanism, and so far right now those mechanism provided by ASEAN is very soft mechanism, but there is a mechanism provided by ASEAN, not a formal rigid mechanism compared to our colleague in Europe.
Yes, okay. I wanted to ask this question to Colin, actually, and maybe Richard can chip in also. We are seeing geopolitical tensions rising in the Indo-Pacific, but I have also seen in the past that the military-to-military relations can actually make things easier and softer, right? Contrary to public opinion that, hey, the mil-mil relations must be hardened, but sometimes it's not the case. Yeah. Would you agree that in times like this, that mil-mil relations between, for example, U.S. China or Japan China, or even ASEAN countries towards China and the U.S. and so on, would be helpful in reducing the level of tension?
Yeah. Thank you, Park Dino. This is a very good question that I grappled with for some time now, and I would like to share my observation on that. We're seeing a sort of contradiction here, because in the context of strategic trust deficit, then it means we need more military-to-military interactions to serve as a confidence-building buffer. But at the same time, it's also true that the strategic trust deficit prevented military-to-military interactions in that regard. So sometimes, we find ourselves in this very ironic situation. But then again, if we talk about male-to-male relationship, we always see in multifaceted form, and yet at various levels. For example, say between the US and China, some of those key higher level interactions were affected due to the rising tensions between the two powers. But on the ground, at the tactical level, it seems to tell a very different story. For example, on the almost daily basis, US and Chinese naval vessels come in contact with each other out there at sea around the region, but they actually conduct their business together professionally, right? And at least for more than 90% of the time, the interactions have been professional, have been safe, and there has been some personal rapport that is reported, between the ground commanders in that respect. That I would say as comforting, because at the very least, end of the day, if there is an absence of political trust or higher level confidence building measures, then I think we have to depend on the operators on the ground, the on-scene commanders, to exercise proper judgment and to thereby avoid incidents. And that is with the assumption that we'll have to live with this uncertainty and live with this tension going forward. So I don't think all is lost, but I think in a way we need to really sit down and ask ourselves what we are actually gunning for. I mean, if there is strategic trust deficit, then jolly well we do something like what Biden has said in his summit with Xi Jinping. He talked about common sense guardrails, right? It's those higher level operational strategic guardrails that are important. Thank you.
Yes. Richard, you want to add to that?
Very quick on this. Yeah, I mean, recently we had the PLA folks acting as pandas, telling the wolf warriors to to zip it or you tone it down, because if it comes to war, it's the soldiers who will pay the price, not some of these wolf warrior guys, right? And this is, I think, emblematic of the more fundamental problem we're facing, which is the rise of paramilitary forces, rise of militia forces, particularly in the South China Sea. Those are the ones I'm more worried about. Actually, I have a lot of confidence in the military to military discussion, whether it's PLA folks, whether it's an American folks, our folks talking to each other. I'm very confident in that. I think we're moving in more queues and more levels of, you know, emergency prevention, management crisis, but it's really on the level of paramilitary and gray zone threats that I'm really worried about. And coming from the Philippines, we saw how that got ugly a few years ago when a suspected Chinese militia sank a Filipino boat and almost killed more than 24 Filipinos, except the Vietnamese were also illegally in the water, so they got to save us. So thanks for Vietnamese fishermen illegally entering our water in that instant only, right? So for me, that's emblematic, and it shocks me how little ASEAN is discussing that, because militarization for me could be a bigger problem than militarization. And we know what's militarization, right? When you send a bunch of hot-headed, undertrained wackos, right, to essentially be the tail that wags the dog. So I rather see Xi Jinping more in control in China. I rather see governments having clear communication channels and command structures. And I want to see fewer of these armadas of militia forces in the South China Sea. That is really my worry, the militarization of disputes like the South China Sea.
Okay, interesting. Now, I want to ask all three of you a question, and I just need short answers. And it's either a dumb question or not so dumb question, right? But you know, when I talk to people about U.S.-China rivalry or Japan-China tension and so on, I always get questions. Hey, what if, as a form of confidence-building measure that Colin mentioned, what if the U.S. and China conduct a military exercise, joint military exercise, right? And some American friends or some Chinese friends say, that's dumb idea, you know, we don't get along, you know, right? But tell me, why is that such a dumb idea, or not really a dumb idea, right? I don't know. Colin, you want to come first? Is that too much to ask, or is that a valid question?
Well, I mean, even for the ongoing exercises that we have, for example, Cobra Go that is hosted by Thailand and the US, there is always, in the recent years, a PLA contingent, but of course they serve more as an observer role in that regard, and they don't send assets over to the exercise. And there are also other HADR type exercises that were conducted between the US and China. But I think more emblematic is actually, this invite to China some years back to the US hosted RIMPAC exercise with the sort of idea that if you invite China, first, you're inviting them to spy on us, and they are not showing goodwill because they send a spy vessel along as well to get crashed. On the other hand, sending this invitation to China is akin to sort of endorsing what China is doing. So it's not just about defense diplomacy or military diplomacy. It goes all the way down into ideological considerations. So it may be a dumb idea to the ideologues, but to the practitioners who are very eager to try to find ways and means to cooperate together practically, I think this is a good idea and something that at least can be entertained. There are various levels of exercises that can be explored. It doesn't have to be all down into a major exercise, which I believe right now the Indo-PACOM and the PLA might have been looking into. Thank you.
Pak Andi, dumb idea or not so dumb idea? Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think maybe in the last 4 years there have been several military exercise between US and China, but it is not in the form of conventional warfare exercise. It is in the form of humanitarian mission. It is in the form of disaster management and so on. Yeah, in 2017, I think in Portland, Oregon. In 2018, back to mainland China and so on. So there were some kind of military interaction in the form of military exercise, but not in a more I think lower political sensitivity rather than deal directly with the conventional warfare exercise. But it is a good start, but we have to see if this is the trust building. So we have to see if with this kind of disaster management or humanitarian military exercise, those both country can build trust to engage in a more formal military exercise.
Okay, final question, and I just need one or two words from each participant. It's imagine 20 years from now, right? And as we see the flashpoints that we see today across the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, the East China Sea, all the other flashpoints in our region. 20 years from now, and Richard Heydarian is married to Miss Philippines and have 5 kids or 10 kids, right? Colin Ko is a billionaire, and Andy may be the president of Indonesia, right? Which flashpoints in 20 years' time you think will be gone? I say this because in our country, Aceh was a 30-year war, insurgency. And if you ask me in the 80s, would Aceh war be resolved? I would say probably not, but I was surprised. It was resolved, right? So in your prediction, 20 years from now, which conflict or flashpoints would be resolved in 20 years' time? Not a long answer, just a quick identification. I'll start with Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Pak Dino, for having such high ambitions for me compared to the 2 other guys. I'd rather be the billionaire or president than married, to be honest, anytime soon. So maybe that will be my quick answer. Well, honestly, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, there was a sense in Europe that Cold War was over. But look here in Asia, all the conflict of Cold War is still there, right? The Korean Peninsula is still divided. The Taiwan Strait issue is still there. So I never underestimate the ability of us to keep kicking the can down the road, right? So I won't be surprised 20 years from now, maybe some of us are married already or have second wives or whatever, but a lot of these conflicts will still stay frozen. So is that a good thing? I don't know, but I'd rather have that than us flirting with the cataclysmic kind of catharsis. I'd rather have that. So maybe if I'm going to bet, I think the Taiwan issue will be resolved, but hopefully not in the way I suspect it will be resolved. That's just what I'm going to say.
Yeah, Colin?
Yeah, I agree with Richard, and thanks so much. I hope to be a billionaire. Then I could go and move on to do other things. But yeah, I agree with Richard, and I think we have to take the consideration that 20 years down the road, we will have newer generations coming in who might have more hardened resolve when it comes to their nationalism over various issues, not least territorial issues. This is not going to be resolved solely based on our understanding of, say, international law. For example, this is much more intractable than we think of. It involves history, it involves politics, and this keeps hardening over time as generations come about. So I'm not that sanguine that we will see any of the flashpoints in the region being gone 20 years or 30 years down the road, unfortunately. Yeah.
Andy?
Yeah, almost a similar perspective. I think all the flashpoint related to the high politic, very sensitive sovereignty issue or border will still be there. Yeah, but I hope that, as Richard mentioned, the problem of transnational activity, transnational crime could be resolved, such as piracy, militia in South China Sea could be resolved, but the hardcore one related to sovereignty, related to the territorial border, I think it will be very, very hard to resolve in the next 20 years.
Okay. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm really sorry to end this. We could go on for another 2 hours. I want to thank our speakers, Pa Andi Wijayanto, Colin Ko, and Richard Hederian for your insights and for your candor. I hope everyone has enjoyed this session. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And we look forward to seeing you in the next FPCI webinars. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dino. That was brilliant, brilliant moderation.
Dino.
Thank you,
our
Pak
audience.
Dino.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And
See you
Khalid.
all.
That
See you all. Catch up soon.
Yes, will do. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Dr. Dino. Once again, thank you, Bapak Andi, Dr. Colin, also Professor Richard, for such an interesting discussion on arms race in Indo-Pacific region. We have over 350 participants tuning in to our discussion from both Zoom and also our YouTube channel, and a lot of questions coming in through our chat box here and there, and we definitely can feel the enthusiasm from the audience throughout the session. It has been a fruitful discussion, and for everyone's information here, today's event is available for rewatch on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Ladies and gentlemen, that was all for our public discussion today. You can follow our social media handles for more information about activities and events and programs in the future occasions via Instagram or also Twitter at FPC Indo. Thank you everyone for tuning in. You may now leave the Zoom meeting. See you.